At 74, Mark Knopfler auctioned his guitars for nearly $9 million. Fans thought it meant a comeback. They were wrong. For decades, people asked the same question: why won't Dire Straits reunite? The answer wasn't creative differences or scheduling conflicts. It was something deeper, something tied to 216 concerts across 14 brutal months, a broken relationship with his own brother, and a lifestyle that nearly destroyed him. In 2024, he finally admitted the shocking truth about what those stadium tours really cost him, and why no amount of money could ever bring him back. Mark Freuder Knopfler came into the world on 12th of August 1949 in Glasgow, a city still tired and bruised from war. Food was still rationed, bombed streets were still being rebuilt, even though World War II had ended 4 years earlier in 1945. His parents had married in Newcastle in 1947 and then moved north, squeezing 3 children into a small flat. Ruth arrived in 1947, Mark in 1949, and David in 1952. Work was drying up in Glasgow's shipyards, and fear of outsiders was growing. His father was Hungarian and Jewish, already marked as different, and steady work as an architect kept slipping through his fingers. Money was tight, and nerves were tighter. When Mark was 7 in 1956, the family packed up again. They left Scotland and traveled about 120 miles southeast to Blyth in Northumberland, a coal port by the North Sea. It was his mother Louisa's hometown, and they hoped her teaching job could keep the family standing. The move felt quiet and gray. A hard city was traded for a small working town. Without knowing it, Mark had crossed his first border, one that would shape how he saw the world. Louisa Mary Laidler came from Blyth, a place built on coal, ships, and hard routines. She trained as a teacher and played piano, and she used both to keep the family moving forward. After school, she would gather the children around the piano and lead sing-alongs, even after long days of teaching. Often it was her paycheck that held the house together. Blyth sat just 10 miles north of Newcastle, close enough for Mark to watch factories fade and working people endure. Those streets, those accents, and that quiet toughness later slipped into his songs through exact place names and plain words that never begged for sympathy. His father, Erwin, carried a heavier shadow. Born into a Hungarian Jewish family, he fled Budapest in 1939 at about 16 years old as anti-Jewish laws tightened and Europe slid toward disaster. He reached Britain alone. The family he left behind faced the Holocaust while he tried to survive as a stateless refugee. In Glasgow and later in Blyth, his accent, his politics, and his Marxist and agnostic views kept him on the edge of polite post-war Britain. At home, he argued fiercely about religion, power, war, and class, moving ideas across the table like chess pieces. He trusted thought more than authority after watching Europe tear itself apart. Years later, Mark would turn that same doubt into songs that quietly question war and nationalism without shouting. Home life was full of love, but never calm. Ideas clashed. Money worries hung in the air. Louisa pushed education and music, believing they were a way out. Erwin pushed thinking and debate, refusing easy answers. Mark watched his father's ideals crash against Britain's careful class system in the 1950s. He absorbed the tension between belief and reality. That feeling later lived inside his music, in songs about ordinary men trapped inside systems bigger than them, sung without drama or hero poses. Music truly grabbed him after the move to Blyth. Around 7 years old, he watched his uncle Kingsley sit at the piano and pound out boogie-woogie rhythms while blowing blues on a harmonica. Those sounds stunned him. He later said those simple 3 chords were the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. He did not own a guitar, so he grabbed a cheap tennis racket and played it like one, shaping chords in the air, acting out a future he could not yet name but already needed. Around 1959, when he was about 10, his parents finally bought him a real guitar. It was a low-cost Spanish-style instrument, nothing like the red Fender Stratocaster he dreamed about. He was left-handed but learned on a right-handed guitar anyway, rewiring himself out of necessity. The strings sat high, the neck felt thick, and his fingers ached every day. There was no amplifier, no extra gear, so he played softly with bare fingers instead of a pick. His thumb and fingers learned to work separately. What felt like limitation quietly became his voice. That gentle finger style later became the sound people would instantly recognize. Teenage years in Blyth and Newcastle were not kind. Being different marked him. School could be rough, so he hid in his room with the guitar. Late at night, he leaned close to a small radio, stopping and starting songs to catch Beatles lines, Bob Dylan chords, and Chicago blues bends. He joined school bands in the 1960s, moving through skiffle, folk, and early rock. But the real work happened alone. Obsession mixed with loneliness. His bedroom became a private music school long before anyone paid attention. Money fear followed him. He had watched his father fight for work his whole life. One missed payment could tilt everything. That insecurity settled deep. Years later, it surfaced in Sultans of Swing, written in the mid-1970s and released in 1978, watching small pub bands play for almost nothing while the world keeps moving. In 1970, around age 20, he studied English at the University of Leeds and finished in 1973. While others planned safe futures, he spent nights in small clubs across Leeds and Yorkshire, playing folk and blues with Steve Phillips as the Duolian string pickers. The rooms were smoky. The crowds were small, maybe 30 people. Pay was a few pounds and free drinks. He was building the style that would later define him, slowly and without shortcuts. In April 1970, he recorded a home-style demo called Summer's Coming My Way. His degree said English, but his heart had already chosen music. After graduating, he took a job as an English lecturer at Loughton College in Essex in 1973. It was survival, not destiny. By day, he taught. By night, he played London's pub rock circuit with bands like Brewer's Droop and later the Cafe Racer. He hauled gear into vans and played low-paid shows. His teaching wage bought a motorbike, kept his father's car running, and paid for more guitars. That double life ran through the mid-1970s and quietly set the stage for what came next. Brewer's Droop was a struggling pub band when he joined them in 1973. They played hard rooms, drank heavy crowds, and chased work that barely paid. Recordings he made with them stayed unreleased until 1989, sitting unheard for about 16 years. In June 1977, Mark Knopfler was 27 and barely hanging on in southeast London. He lived in a shabby council flat in Deptford, trying to survive on small teaching jobs and bits of journalism while playing pub gigs at night. London felt loud and crowded and expensive, and most days he was counting coins. Still, that summer, something clicked. He pulled together a band with his younger brother David on rhythm guitar, John Ilsley on bass, who worked as a social worker by day, and Pick Withers on drums, a jazz-leaning player who had already done real session work. They rehearsed wherever they could squeeze in. Tiny flats, mattresses stacked against walls, extension leads running across the floor, a few beaten-up amps shared by everyone because no one could afford more. Sometimes Mark walked miles across the city with his guitar in a soft case just to save bus fare. It was uncomfortable and sweaty and uncertain. Yet within a year, songs born in those cramped rooms would be played on stages around the world. They did not even have a band name at first. One night, a friend heard them stressing over unpaid rent and empty wallets and laughed, saying they were in dire straits. The words stuck because they felt too true. Around July 1977, they scraped together less than £50, borrowed a 2-track Revox machine, and recorded a demo in a friend's kitchen. Blankets were thrown over cupboards to kill the echo. Tape was expensive, so they recorded fast and moved on. No retakes, no polish. On that cheap tape were early versions of Sultans of Swing, Down to the Waterline, Water of Love, and Wild West End. The demo was copied onto cassettes and hand-delivered to DJs and labels across London. Most never replied, but the sound was clean enough to reveal Mark's finger-style guitar and calm storytelling voice. A kitchen recording was quietly opening doors. One of those tapes landed with Charlie Gillette at BBC Radio London. He hosted a Sunday show called Honky Tonk and actually listened. In late 1977, he invited the band to play a small pub show, the kind of place where the crowd barely fills the room. That night, they played Sultans of Swing. The song itself came from a moment months earlier when Mark had watched an amateur jazz band playing to almost nobody in a near-empty bar, proudly calling themselves the Sultans of Swing. He wrote the phrase down that same night. On 34's version, July 1977, Gillette played the demo on air and read out the band's name and address. Letters and phone calls started coming in. Labels that had ignored them suddenly cared. One radio play changed everything in under 6 weeks. By late 1977, Dire Straits signed with Vertigo under Phonogram. It came after countless rejections from A&R people who thought guitar bands were finished because punk had taken over. In February 1978, they walked into Basing Street Studios in Notting Hill with producer Muff Winwood and a budget of about £2,500. Tiny even even then. They recorded the entire album in about 2 weeks, cutting many tracks live, keeping the sound raw and tight, just like the pubs. When the album came out in 1978, it started slow in the UK, but Sultans of Swing caught fire on FM radio in the Netherlands and the United States. By early 1979, the single hit number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100, and the album climbed into the UK Top 10 and number 2 in the US. More than 1 million copies sold within a year. A band that could barely pay rent was suddenly touring internationally. The success came fast, but cracks were already forming. Mark wrote most of the songs and controlled the arrangements. David, only 25 when the band formed, felt pushed to the side. He brought songs to early sessions that never made the album. Arguments over guitar parts and studio decisions grew sharper. Even as fans fell in love with the early Dire Straits sound, two brothers were drifting apart. The pace never slowed. Communique was recorded quickly in late 1978 and early 1979 with Jerry Wexler and Barry Beckett, including sessions in the Bahamas. It was released in June 1979, barely a year after the debut. That year alone, they played well over 110 shows, sometimes a concert every 2 or 3 days. Life became buses, hotels, sound check, and late night. Mark later admitted the album sounded too close to the first one. That boredom followed him on the road. In July 1980, recording for Making Movies began in New York with producer Jimmy Iovine. The pressure was heavier. The sessions dragged on. Romeo and Juliet came straight from a painful breakup, giving the song its sharp edge. By August 1980, the tension exploded. David walked out mid-recording. None of his parts were kept. A family band turned into something colder and lonelier in less than 3 years. By the time Brothers in Arms was recorded between late 1984 and early 1985 at AIR Studios Montserrat, everything had changed. The budget was around £300,000. The studio sat near a volcano. Storms rolled in while the band worked on one of the first fully digital rock albums ever made. When it came out in May 1985, it sold over 30 million copies worldwide and became the first album to sell 1 million CDs. Money for Nothing went to number 1 in the US. The video became the first ever aired on MTV UK. Ironically, a song mocking rock star excess turned Dire Straits into a symbol of it. The Brothers in Arms tour ran from 1985 into 1986 and beyond, with roughly 230 to 247 shows in about 100 cities, playing to around 7.1 million people. Mark played 3-hour shows night after night. His hands suffered, tendons and nerves inflamed. He iced them in hotel rooms just to keep going. At home, his marriage strained. His twin sons, born in 1987, mostly saw him on television. In 1991, Mark Knopfler walked into the next Dire Straits chapter, like a man carrying a shadow on his back. On Every Street was meant to be the big follow-up to Brothers in Arms, the record that had sold 30 million copies. That number hung in the air even when nobody said it out loud. So when recording began in early 1990, it was not just about making song. It was about trying to match a moment that had already become a legend. And this is where Mark's perfectionism stopped being a strength and started becoming a cost. He kept scrapping parts. He kept rewriting. A bar here, a chord there, a line that did not feel right, a take that sounded good but not perfect. So the band kept going back into the studio. Weeks turned into months. The release kept getting delayed. Meanwhile, the money kept burning like a slow fire. When the album finally landed, it did not flop. It moved a solid 5 to 5.3 million copies worldwide. That is huge for most artists, but it felt small beside 30 million. Expectations can turn a win into something that feels like a loss. Still, in places like France, the machine behind the album went all in. The label shipped 300,000 units before release. The record debuted at number 1. Then it crossed 1.2 million copies sold and earned a diamond certification. On paper, it looked like a triumph, but then the mood shifted. Sales slowed later. Critics and fans began saying it did not hit like the 1979 to 1985 era. Even Mark later admitted he could feel, deep down, that the era was ending while he was still trying to perfect every single bar. Then came the tour, and once the tour started, there was no gentle pace. From August 1991 to October 1992, Dire Straits ran a marathon that stretched to roughly 216 concerts across Europe, North America, and Australia. About 7.1 million tickets were sold. That is the kind of number that can look like glory from far away. Up close, it can feel like a trap. The band on stage was not even the same band from the early days. Rhythm guitarist Phil Palmer replaced founding member David Knopfler Knopfler. The live lineup grew into a big touring machine. Night after night, they built long shows around extended versions of Telegraph Road, Sultans of Swing, and the new material. It was polished. It was powerful. It was also exhausting. Some weeks had 4 or 5 arena shows packed into a single week. Travel days did not feel like rest. They felt like more work, just done inside airports, buses, and hotel rooms. And sooner or later, the body collects its payment. Late in the tour, in Milan, exhaustion reportedly caught Mark in a moment he could not outplay. He became so dehydrated and fatigued that he needed IV fluids backstage. Multiple shows had to be canceled. That was the ugly truth cracking through the smooth surface. It showed how close the whole thing was to a physical collapse. People around the tour later described it as 14 months on a conveyor belt, like life had become a moving line and you could not step off. And all the while, the music that sounded so open and clean on record was hiding tension underneath. Years earlier, original drummer Pick Withers had already walked away after 1982's Love Over Gold. He described Mark's increasingly meticulous studio approach and long rehearsals as dictatorial. To him, it was not a fit. His instincts were jazzier. Mark's direction was tighter. That difference was not a small thing. It was the kind of difference that slowly breaks a band's chemistry. By the time On Every Street arrived, the old core was gone. Withers never came back. David Knopfler had left way back during the tense Making Movies sessions in 1980. The rhythm section was built from session pros, rather than the gang that once formed songs in tiny rooms in Deptford in the late 1970s. The touring lineup could reproduce the parts flawlessly, but some critics and fans said it felt too polished, less risky, less alive, like it was Mark Knopfler plus an expert backing band, not a group moving together as one unit. That quiet shift mattered. It pushed them toward the edge even if the crowds were still huge. When the tour finally wound down in late 1992, Mark was finished in a way that had nothing to do with charts. He was physically tired, mentally drained. He put Dire Straits on hiatus instead of announcing a clean breakup, but privately, he had no desire to return to the arena treadmill. And there was another silence running parallel to all of this. The silence between brothers. David had quit in 1980, and the relationship never truly recovered. Over the years, interviews hinted at how little they spoke since the early 1990s. There were resentments about songwriting credit, control, and what it felt like to leave right as success exploded. Fans kept hoping for reconciliation and a proper farewell, but time has its own gravity. Mark built one life, David built another. The distance stayed, and it lasted more than 3 decades. In 1995, Dire Straits officially dissolved after 6 studio albums, even though they were still one of the best-selling rock acts on the planet, with tens of millions of records sold worldwide. That is the part that shocks people. Most bands would chase the next tour just to taste that power again, but Mark kept stepping away. Promoters kept coming. Offers kept getting bigger. Bassist John Illsley has described the reunion money as huge amounts, with 8-figure packages dangled for a world tour built around Money for Nothing and Brothers in Arms. Illsley has said that every time he met Mark's manager, there was another gigantic proposal on the table. Yet Mark kept saying no again and again. He insisted he was happier doing quieter solo tours, writing and working on his own terms. For him, it was not about nostalgia. It was about sanity. It was about creative freedom. It was about never getting trapped inside that pressure cooker again. So instead of returning to stadium rock, he reset his whole life in public. On 25th of March 1996, he released his first solo studio album, Golden Heart. It came 8 years after Dire Straits' last studio record, On Every Street, in 1991, and 1 year after the band formally dissolved in 1995. The direction was clear. Smaller rooms, different colors. A studio team shaped around Guy Fletcher, and a mix of Nashville and Irish session players. The sound leaned into British folk, Celtic touches, and country swing. Quieter, more personal. The album ran 71 minutes and had 14 tracks. It reached the UK top 10, and that solo path turned into a long second life, with 5 studio albums released between 1996 and 2007, later remastered as a single box set in 2021, like a clean line drawn between who he was then and who he chose to become. Even before all of that, Mark had already been building another identity in the background. Back in 1983, he accepted the job to score Local Hero, before Dire Straits had even released Brothers in Arms. That timing matters, because because it shows the mindset. He was writing music for a modest Scottish comedy long before he became a stadium headliner. The schedule was tight. He wrote and recorded dozens of short cues in just a few weeks to fit exact scene timings, the kind of work that forces discipline. And then something unexpected happened. The closing theme, Going Home, built on a simple guitar motif, took on a second life. It became the pre-match anthem at Newcastle United's St. James's Park. Tens of thousands of people have heard it blasted through speakers for years. A small 1983 movie tune turned into one of Britain's most heard instrumental themes. Then, in 1987, with The Princess Bride, he leaned even harder into doing things his own way. Director Rob Reiner wanted a big orchestral swashbuckler sound. Mark refused to deliver that. Instead, he centered the score on a synclavier, an expensive digital synthesizer, layering it with acoustic guitars and a few live instruments. Much of the music was created inside that one system. Mark would improvise while watching scenes. Guy Fletcher would scramble to capture rapid changes in harmony and rhythm in real time. And tucked inside that world was Storybook Love, written and sung by Willie DeVille, produced and integrated into the score by Mark. It earned an Academy Award nomination in 1988, but it lost to I've Had the Time of My Life from Dirty Dancing. Still, the melody stayed alive, and it continues to anchor live orchestral Princess Bride concerts decades later. By the time Sailing to Philadelphia came out on 26 September 2000, Mark's solo world had grown wider. It was his second solo studio album and his most collaborative, with guest vocals from James Taylor, Van Morrison, and others. It was a 13-track set filled with American roads, radio preachers, and surveyors. The title song drew from Thomas Pynchon's 1997 novel Mason and Dixon, which is not the kind of source most rock stars reach for. The album charted strongly across Europe. It went multi-platinum in places like Norway and Denmark, and platinum in the UK. By 2002, it had sold well over 1 million copies worldwide. Yet even with that success, Mark did not treat the songs like a greatest hits package. He kept rearranging them. He kept stretching pieces like Speedway at Nazareth into long live epics, sometimes pushing past 7 minutes, turning a studio story into a slow, burning climax on tours across 2001 and 2002. Then came the moment that could have ended everything. In March 2003, he crashed his motorbike on Grosvenor Road in Belgravia, London. He broke his collarbone, his shoulder blade, and 7 ribs. Planned tours were cancelled. For around 7 months, he had to stay away from the guitar and do physiotherapy. It was a hard pause, the kind that makes you stare at your hands and wonder if the thing you built your whole life on can be taken away in one morning. But even after that, he did not run back to the old loud life. In February 2004, he went to Shangri-La Studios in Malibu to record an understated album called Shangri-La. The place itself carried history, tied to names like the band, Bob Dylan, and Neil Young. The record ran about 56 minutes and came out later in 2004. And one of its most memorable songs, Boom Like That, was inspired by Ray Kroc's autobiography. After more than 25 years in music, and after a near-fatal crash, he was still willing to base a single on obscure business history rather than safe love songs. That tells you exactly what kind of artist he is when nobody is forcing him to be anything else. And in his personal life, the pattern kept repeating. Big shifts, quiet exits, no spectacle. In March 1972, he married his school-days girlfriend, Kathy White, while studying English at the University of Leeds, back when he was still working as a journalist and playing local pubs for small fees. By 1973, graduation and a move to London created distance. Friends later recalled the split happened sometime between 1973 and the mid-1970s, with no scandal, no court drama, no headline. Just two people growing apart, while one of them gambled everything on a risky dream. The emotional echo of that choice showed up in early Dire Straits songs, capturing loneliness, bedsits, and city wandering. In November 1983, he married Lourdes Salomon, a London music executive, just weeks after Dire Straits finished the long Love Over Gold touring cycle and moved into the pressure that led to Brothers in Arms. In March 1987, at the peak of global fame, they welcomed twin sons, Benji and Joseph, while the band was still riding a tour that began in 1985. Success paid for comfort, but it also kept him gone for months. By 1992 to 1993, as Dire Straits wound down and he turned toward film scores and quieter projects, the marriage ended in divorce after roughly a decade. That split pushed him even deeper into the low-profile path. Then, on 14th February 1997, at age 47, he married British actress and writer Kitty Aldridge in Barbados. Their first daughter, Isabella, arrived in 1998. Their second daughter, Katya Ruby Rose, arrived on 25th of November 2003, just months after the crash. The picture here is not flashy. It is deliberate. A quiet Chelsea home, not a rock star compound. Kitty shifted from acting to writing novels. Mark built British Grove Studios in West London, choosing a routine where he could walk to work instead of vanishing on year-long tours. That marriage has now lasted more than 2 decades, and it lines up with a full reinvention from stadium frontman into an older craftsman focused on tone, story, and family stability. Even when the world tried to drag Dire Straits back onto the stage, he kept slipping away. In December 2017, Dire Straits were announced as Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductees for the 2018 class. The band had moved more than 100 million albums worldwide. The ceremony happened on 14th April 2018 in Cleveland. It should have been a big reunion moment. It was not. Mark did not come. There was no presenter, no introduction, and no performance, making it the first act in Hall history to go on stage with no introduction and no performance. Only John Illsley, Alan Clark, and Guy Fletcher accepted the honor. Illsley later said, "Mark just did not feel like doing a reunion, and there was no point playing without him, and that was it." The absence became part of the legend. Then, late career Mark kept doing what he always did: quiet work, precise choices, numbers that mean something, but not the kind tied to stadium pressure. In April 2024, at age 74, he released his 10th solo album, One Deep River, recorded at British Grove Studios in London. The standard edition had 12 songs and came out on 11th April 2024. The tracks pulled from memories of the River Tyne. In the same year, he auctioned over 120 guitars and amps for $884 million at Christie's. At least 25% of that sale went to charities including the British Red Cross, Tusk, Brave Hearts of the Northeast, and Teenage Cancer Trust. No reunion tour, no stadium cycle, just controlled work and charity numbers that were too clear to ignore.